You're listening to Music Tectonics.
Hi there, everybody. Welcome to Music Tectonics. I'm your irregular guest host, Tristan Nuyerjaeger, strategist at Rock Paper Scissors, a music tech PR firm. I'm really thrilled to talk today with Dr. Dawn Rose, a senior researcher at the Lucerne University of Applied Sciences and Arts in Switzerland. Her research is focused on musician health and health through music, subjects that speak loudly to many of you out there in the music tech community. She received her PhD from Goldsmiths, University of London, writing her dissertation on the effects of music education in children and adults. As part of her postdoctoral research fellowship at the University of Hertfordshire, she investigated the effects of auditory cueing for people with Parkinson's. And I really hope I got Hertfordshire right. On top of her academic work, Dr. Rose is a drummer, martial artist, and trained therapist specializing in performance anxiety. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Rose. Or is it okay if I call you Dawn?
Of course, call me Dawn Tristra, and it's Hertfordshire, if you want to be completely correct.
I knew I was going to yankify that and completely flub that as I was about to say the word. So I'm glad. It's really, really awesome to both learn how to say Hertfordshire and to get to talk to you today about all things music, health, and body-mind related. So I'm going to start off with one of my favorite questions and one of the easiest questions I hope to answer, which is, how did you get into music, Dawn?
Actually, my first memory of getting into music is really physical, like something just connected in my body and set me alight. I was 7 years old, and the song was Hit Me With Your Rhythm Stick by Ian Dury and the Blockheads. And I remember hearing it and just running around the room, jumping and dancing like a lunatic, except that everything suddenly made sense. I mean, it's such a weird song now that I think about it, but it was such a visceral experience. And later I learned to play drums, and I think music has been just a really active experience for me ever since. I loved my life as a musician, going on tour and having adventures all over the world, but also teaching, and that's really how I got interested in music and the mind, partly from students who look to you as their teacher to help, but also musician friends who were suffering with things like stage fright. So I started to study, first as a counsellor and hypnotherapist, and then I talked my way onto the Music, Mind and Brain MSc course at Goldsmiths. And I really had no idea what I'd taken on, and it was a seriously steep learning curve. But now somehow I have a PhD in music psychology, though really I'm just the same punk drummer. I mean, I think I'm so lucky. I can hardly believe where music has taken me, and I'm pretty sure it saved me many times over.
That's amazing. So as you're going down this journey and, playing with punk bands and rock bands, when did you first start to get intrigued by music's effects on our mind and body? So how did you go from being a practicing musician to someone who decided to research music?
I guess there were two avenues. So as with most musicians, you sort of have to teach in between touring and try and make ends meet. So on the one hand, there was a kind of pastoral element to looking after my students. And I had students ranging from 6 to 60, but they all had various kind of problems. Sometimes it was something personal, like the children were being bullied, or sometimes it was to do with just being too nervous to sort of enjoy playing. So not really performance anxiety in terms of how musicians have this as a professional concern. But that was the other side of things, was as a musician, I noticed, I mean, I'm lucky because I'm the drummer and I get to sit at the back of the stage, and my gig is mostly everyone's bum. That's what I see, and the crowd is somewhere further off. But for the singers, they have to stand at the front of the stage and actually do eye contact. And I didn't really experience how terrifying that can be until I went into academia and had to give my first public talk. And then I started to really understand how performance anxiety can be detrimental. But for me at that kind of stage, it was just realizing that different people were coping with different problems. And I wanted to learn how to help them, really. So I started off training as a counselor and hypnotherapist as part of a sort of psychotherapy approach, but I kind of became frustrated with that and wanted to know more about what was happening in the brain. And especially with performance anxiety, I mean, musicians have to perform under such extreme conditions with the lights, and, it's really like not a normal situation to put yourself into such a high stress performance mode. So I wanted to know more about what was happening with the brain. And somehow or another, I talked my way onto the Music, Mind and Brain Masters at Goldsmiths in London. And I mean, this was a place where I had walked past and driven past many times going to gigs just to play my punk gigs and stuff. And I'd looked in the library window and thought, oh my gosh, those people are so clever. Imagine being like that. And then suddenly I found myself on a kind of neuroscience of music master's course, and I was very, very out of my depth. So it was a steep learning curve.
That's wild. I love how you've taken all these risks and jumped into these places that you really didn't know how it was going to turn out. And I think that's appropriate for someone who's studying the brain, because the brain is such a mystery. Though we know a great deal and can see a great deal, there's so much still to be fathomed. And it feels like it's the work of millennia to even understand what's going on between our two ears. So speaking of big picture questions and sort of long-term inquiry, what really intrigues you most about your field? What in the neuroscience of music are you most excited about, or most puzzled by, most curious about?
Ooh, probably this will sound strange to psychologists, but it's people. And I say this because a thing I struggle with all the time is the kind of blurry lines between what we measure as psychologists, and that can range from bold signatures in neuroscience to sort of questionnaires where we just look at the mean value and potential shifts and changes of behavior, to how this reflects to the individual. And people always want to know, well, what does this mean for me? And I think that's why I became so interested in applied sciences. But they don't they don't marry up too well in terms of the science of psychology and individual application. So I think that is still a struggle. For me now, I work under this sort of overarching banner of music, health, and well-being, and within that, we look at musicians' health, because there are various vocational, professional strains that people have to deal with. But we also look at, for example, at the moment, we've got a project looking at co-creating a new literacy between teachers and researchers about how to support musicians with their physical and mental health and their well-being as three sort of separate aspects of that. But also, really, working with people with Parkinson's has been incredible. I've never met people who have so much courage and so much personal integrity with what they want to do. They always are involved in the research and offering to help. And it really is very humbling as a scientist / punk drummer to think that you might actually be doing something that will affect people on their personal level. And I guess that's what I'm really focused on at the moment, is looking at how to optimize music to help or optimize the use of music in Parkinson's care. So as a sort of non-pharmacological treatment for their motor and non-motor symptoms.
Can you explain a little bit about what challenges these patients face and how music helps them overcome these challenges, or at least ease these challenges a bit?
Yeah, certainly. So Parkinson's, and I hate to call it Parkinson's disease. This is one of the things I've learned from working with people with Parkinson's, is that, it's such a complex range of symptoms and conditions that they prefer not to kind of put themselves in this kind of disease category and think about what these symptoms are and how they meet or how they impact on their daily life. So it's a very small part of the brain that's affected, but it has so many different symptomologies and ways of impacting their lives. So most people would associate it with this picture of a sort of stooped over person who is shaking and shuffling. And this is only the sort of bare minimum way that it can affect people with Parkinson's. I mean, it really affects so many cycles and rhythms within the body. So physically, digestion and sleep patterns are all affected as well. And we now seem to understand that the non-motor aspects, so the stiffness, obviously being the motor aspects, and problems with walking, are only half of it, and the depression and anxiety and apathy are also a part of, if not exacerbated by, the motor conditions. So really trying to live with the fact that your body does not do what you want it to do and that you can't control that, I think is really I think it's very difficult to live with. And then as the disease progresses, there's also cognitive decline. But this can take, quite a long time, up to 20 years for some people. But the thing is with Parkinson's is that everybody's Parkinson's is different. And so how it affects one person might not be how it affects another. And that can also change within a person from day to day, sometimes dependent on their medication and sometimes not.
So, how does music come into the picture and improve things for these patients?
Well, because medication, it does help with some aspects, but not with all aspects of quality of life. They started to look into ideas around sensory cueing to see how you could help, for example, regulate walking, because the higher incidence of falling caused by, well, there are two aspects of that. One is that when people shuffle and their balance is not so stable, they can easily fall. But there are other aspects of Parkinson's, like festination, which is when people gain momentum when they're walking, for example. So regulating a pace is really important. And some ways of doing this have been looking at, for example, drawing lines on the floor, a bit like a zebra crossing idea, but also kinesthetic things, so like a kind of buzzing machine, a bit like we would have sometimes. Drummers have these attached to their drum stools for tempo regulation, but also auditory. So the most basic form of that being a metronome. But now we're kind of starting to understand that there's a kind of richness within the musical envelope that can be, not for everyone, but it can be more helpful. And this could be to do with learned music, so familiar music specifically, where people have an expectation of what's going to happen. So in Parkinson's, people's not just motor abilities, but their perception of time can be altered as well. So having this external cue to help, well, actually, there's a really famous researcher called Simone de la Bella who talked about temporal scaffolding. And so using, like, if we think of a metronome as a temporal scaffolding, so a predictable thing that's going to happen that the brain can entrain to, and then you can try to synchronize particular movements. So, for example, steps to that. But we also looked at it with dancing because we were wondering what were the underlying mechanisms of why dancing was helping people with Parkinson's. And this seemed to be not just to do with the ability to synchronize with music that they knew, but also the social aspects that music provides and musical activities can foster, sort of called pro-social behaviors, but that's a bit I don't know, sciencey. I mean, basically, it's being with other people and connecting and being able to have fun and forget that you have this condition sometimes that stops you doing things. So one of the ladies I work with, she said that listening to music with Parkinson's was like, it was like you were a marionette or a puppet with your strings all tangled up. And then when you put the music on, it seems to untangle you and you can just move sort of automatically, like it just makes things easier.
That's really beautiful and moving. I mean, forgive the sort of quasi pun there. That's really wonderful. How would this apply in more generally to to the population, those that maybe don't have Parkinson's or other challenges along those lines? But how does some of the things you're learning about these patients and that they're teaching you apply to all of us?
Yeah, well, I know that you're interested in tech, so there's some great motion capture studies going on at the moment, which are showing how people move different parts of their bodies to different aspects of the music. So
Wow.
probably Yeah, unsurprisingly, the lower parts of our bodies tend to move more to the bass kind of frequencies. So I guess that's like, as a drummer, I just like, oh, well, that's the bass drum, obviously. But yeah, that's how people tend to dance. And whereas their hand movements might be more like the offbeat of the hi-hat, that kind of thing. And their head might be doing something slightly different, maybe it's going more with the melody. So the rhythm and melody aspects can interact with different parts of our bodies. And this is kind of where the ideas of entrainment and synchronization can be sort of pulled apart, although they're part of the same concept. So really music works because, in terms of dancing and movement, because it can be predictable. And we know what's coming and we can align our movements to that. But also there's a trance quality, and that's why obviously trance music can be great. You can be moving in a very repetitive way, and this can have, particular effects.
That's really exciting. I love that each parts of our body sort of map onto a different a
A
different
different layer.
section of the musical. Yeah, that's really, really cool. So, are there musical elements people tend to overlook when they're thinking about how music might help them if they're trying to complete or enhance a physical activity, whether it's settling down their body or running a fast mile? I mean, I know you've written a little bit about adding classical music to the mix and
Mm-hmm.
kind of questioning our genre assumptions about what can help us enjoy a fitness experience more. So I was
Yeah.
wondering if there are sort of generalized elements that you want to point to that people should be thinking about as they're thinking about what music might help their body achieve a certain state or goal.
Yeah, sure. Um, in psychology, we tend to think in terms of arousal and valence. So, valence being, I guess, more like happy or sad music. And there's a lot of comfort that people get. There's some great research going on in Finland about this, um, about listening to sad music and how this can, I guess, help us process our emotions, but also it can be a friend. So, I think this is kind of an interesting concept as music as a friend that can, there's a lot of music that can be used for nostalgia as well, and especially for older people this can really help with identity. And I've just been thinking about this for Parkinson's too. So they kind of cross between all these different aspects. Sorry if I'm jumping around, but for example, great athletes have personal anthems often. They kind of come out to a certain song and this gets them going, and it's very arousing, and they kind of, makes them feel alive and ready to fight. If I'm thinking about martial arts, or ready to run if it's, a particular kind of sport it's associated with. But also for people with Parkinson's, this idea of a personal anthem and reclaiming your identity when it's been so savaged by the diagnosis, um, thinking about who you were or trying to find a new way to become. Music really is an enormous part of our lives. Which is why it always gets me when people say, why would you study the psychology of music? And I'm like, but why wouldn't you? I mean, music is I know it's not everything to all people, but it's a ubiquitous, or it's there with us all the time. So I think I've gone off on a tangent now. Sorry.
No, it's perfect actually. So we should basically, what I'm hearing is that considering different aspects of valence and arousal, as you put it in psychological terms, can help us maybe discover our own new personal anthems or music that will help us do what we want to do, whether it's finally
Yeah.
calm down after a stressful day
Yep.
or a week or a year, or
Exactly.
get out there and really enjoy a run as opposed to just plodding through it thinking I have to be healthy. So, um,
Yeah. So music is most often, studies have shown that music is chosen as mood regulation. So it's not that it's not that we're feeling happy and then we put on happy music. It's that we're getting ready for a party and we want to get ourselves in the mood, and we'll choose, get the party started, or something that kind of fosters these feelings that we want to enjoy. Um, But we also use music for anxiolytic effects, so to calm us down. And for example, when you're thinking about putting together a playlist for your workout, you have to think about the arc of what you want to do. So you have a warm up, then you maybe have some cardio, then you maybe have some weights or something, and then a cool down. I mean, that's a very basic workout, obviously. But thinking about the arc of the music and the journey of the music as part of that. I mean, it's not like you have to do an entire playlist in classical music. It could be that you just have, I don't know, a beautiful piece at the end that helps you kind of calm down and kind of regain your equilibrium after you've been exerting yourself. But this is an interesting thing, is that lots of people think that arousal, like having a fast beat, means that your heart rate will automatically increase. But this is such an interesting aspect of physiological and of psychology, is that really we have yet to kind of find the answer to how music affects your heart rate. So for some people, really fast, like pumping music will actually slow down their heart rate, whereas for other people, it will have a sort of, an intuitive arousal effect. So don't just assume that the music will get your heartbeat going. You might be one of these people that it has the inverse requirement or inverse effect on. I was actually going to mention one other thing, if it's okay, which is about people with Parkinson's. And this is research that I'm thinking about at the moment, which is the music often acts as part of our reward system. And this is based on one of many neurotransmitters involved, but dopamine is the main one we think about when we think about Parkinson's. And I think that it's interesting, but not yet answered, to think about how, for example, the dopamine replacement therapy might affect the reward cycle of music consumption for people with Parkinson's. And there's been quite a lot of work about, for example, dopamine overuse and shopping and sex addictions for people with Parkinson's, but that hasn't really been looked at with music yet. And similarly with that kind of anxiolytic effect of looking at, well, if we are having a lot of dopamine put into our system, then is it possible, like, do we need to think about music in a different way when we think about using it to relax in the evening? But loads of people I've spoken to with Parkinson's ask Alexa to put on their favorite relaxing piece of music at night. So I think it probably does still work, but we just have to be mindful of the effects of this replacement dopamine, I think.
That's fascinating. So, I know speculation isn't the favorite thing of scholars, but you're also a drummer and a musician, and someone who obviously has a deep connection to music. So I'm going to ask you to get a little tiny bit speculative. If you had a magic wand, what would you create or transform regarding the way we use or think about music, dance, and health? So if you could invent a kind of space where people could come if they were looking to address certain health issues, or a device, or a certain kind of music curation system, or what do you dream about when you sort of just fantasize about, oh, wouldn't it be cool if this existed?
I'm kind of working on it at the moment. It is the idea of developing an inner jukebox of music to help, in this instance, people with Parkinson's overcome freeze of gait, which is where they're walking and they just stop or they can't get started. So this idea is based around musical imagery. I'm not a fan of the word imagery when we're thinking of sound, but no one seems to have come up with anything better yet. But it's the idea of music inside your mind, so the sort of endogenous experience. And this can be memories of music that you know well, or it can be music that you're just making up. I mean, I'm a drummer and obviously therefore a bit crazy. And if I go for a walk, I'm often trying to evaluate which time signature I'm walking in, or making up some kind of silly rhyme to walk along to, or something like this. I think it's something to do with counting and being a drummer. But the idea of this inner jukebox is to find a way to help people use the music inside their minds to support what they need to do. And I think, I don't know, my PhD was really about looking at the transfer effects of musical learning in children. And there's been kind of sporadic attempts to support music in schools because the arts can help cognitive learning. And this is a bit of a double-edged sword. If we could understand, the contribution that music makes as an art and in terms of, building teamwork, fostering the ability to practice something and actually get a result at the end of it, we could think of music learning in a much better way. But one of the things that really helped me with kind of being able to memorize things is a thing that most music teachers teach all the time, which are called vocables sometimes. So thinking of little rhymes and ways to memorize stuff. And there's been studies that have shown that if you try and learn a new language, for example, if you learn it with some background kind of beats or something like this, it's actually much easier to remember these things. So I think really if we can embed music and using music in interesting and creative ways rather than just as a product to sell, then from an early childhood, then we can really start to see how this could become embedded in our society. And I think we would value music more because of that. I know that there are lots of now great apps being developed to help people in these kind of ways. But maybe this comes out of necessity being the mother of all inventions, because musicians need to get very creative now about how to make a living. And musicians can be very techy, so it can work really well. But I guess for me, I went down the kind of psychology route, and I find it interesting to think about how we can even think about music and what it can do.
I love the idea of using the music in your head, and you're right, imagery isn't really what it is. It's, it's like literally like the echo of a sound that somehow slightly
Yeah,
less colorfully in your head, is, as if that makes any sense or
yeah.
not. You thought you were getting off on a tangent. But it would be amazing to learn how to use that in new ways to make our lives go a little bit more smoothly, whether we're a child who's trying to emotionally regulate or learn,
Yep,
impulsivity control, or an elder who
exactly.
is having to relearn walking after a stroke or something like that. That's a wonderful, wonderful idea. Well, is there anything else from your research or from your musical life that we haven't touched on that you'd like to share?
One of the things that I've just put in a bid for some funding for is to develop a way of using pressure sensitive gait mats. So they don't just measure, how often you step, like with the pressure with your feet, with also with motion capture. And I'm going to build a sort of doorway to try and uh, instigate this freeze of gait problem that people with Parkinson's had, and then really look at the difference between external music, so music that we hear, and internalized music in terms of how we can use this to help regulate the stepping. So it was fun trying to come up with a way of getting of sort of operationalizing this as an experiment. So obviously heard music, you have to be a bit careful about, which parameters you use, which keys it's in, if it's all the same tempo and this kind of stuff. But asking people to think about music inside their mind, I was like, how are we ever going to test this? It's going to be really difficult to actually put this into action. So I made a little, a kind of marching song, but like a fun marching song, hopefully, that people can learn easily. And I think that's kind of an exciting experiment that sort of shows the nature of the work I do. So, in order to actually do that, I managed to get some funding to go and work with Caroline Wyatt at the University of Hertfordshire. She's the motion caption specialist there. And then also with Jessica Gran over at the University of Western Ontario at the Brain and Mind Institute there to work with the gate map. And then I come back to Switzerland and try and figure it all out. And then hopefully we'll have a new way to quantify how music inside and out can help people with Parkinson's regulate their movements, because we live in such an evidence-based society, and the more and more health insurance and this kind of way that we medicalize everything happens, we kind of have to work on getting the evidence. But mostly what I'm interested in is what kind of music people come up with inside their minds. I think this will be a fascinating journey. It's me going back to the people. They're the ones that matter.
I love that you had to compose a little piece of music as part of this plan for the experiment.
Yeah.
That's really amazing. It'll be great to see how the participants change it as they attempt to make use of it in their minds. That'll be really, really interesting. Well, thank you so much for your time, Dawn. This has been fascinating, and I'm sure we could talk for hours more about music and movement and dance and the rhythms of the body
Thanks for
and mind.
inviting me. Yeah.
But I really appreciate
Thank you.
taking the time out from your busy schedule to chat with us. And for our listeners, if you're interested in exploring more, we'll put some links in the show notes to some of Dawn Rose's more lay person oriented writing, as well as some academic articles. So you can dig in a little bit more. Thanks again, Dawn, and good luck with the upcoming experiment.
Thanks very much, Tristra. Thanks for inviting me on.
If you're listening to this podcast, the Music Tectonics Conference was made for you. We want to give you the chance to win a free ticket to join us online, in the metaverse, and on a carousel by the sea. I have dibs on the dolphin, by the way, and it's actually a carousel by the sea. It's pretty exciting. Anyway, sign up for the Music Tectonics newsletter by June 21st, 2021, and you'll be entered with other new subscribers in a drawing for a free conference ticket. Well, what do you say? You're already a subscriber? Well, that's no big deal. Don't worry about it. We got you covered. You'll be entered in a separate drawing just for our loyal readers. Subscribe at musictectonics.com to enter.
Thanks for listening to Music Tectonics. If you like what you hear, please hit subscribe on your favorite podcast app. We put out new episodes every week. Want more? Find it at musictectonics.com. You can dig deeper into this episode, learn about our annual conference, get the Music Tectonics app, and sign up for our newsletter. Musictectonics.com has it all. Also, look for Music Tectonics on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and Clubhouse. And connect with me, Dmitry Vitsa, on LinkedIn. Peace.
You're listening to Music Tectonics.